The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Renee Bryant. Renee spent 13 years as a teacher of visual arts, poetry, and theater to K-8 students at a classical liberal arts charter school in Arizona. It is here that she specialized in cultivating a love of the beautiful and a sense of wonder in her students. After discovering the work of Dr. Stuart Brown, Renee used this research of play and creativity as a primary tool for student learning with great success. In 2023, she founded PlayRx, a business designed to bring the healing elements of play and creativity to adults. I first discovered Renee through her Instagram reels, where I was absolutely taken by her joyousness, her play, and her perspective on the essential and powerful nature of play in adult life. Our conversation is deeply enriching, and I am thoroughly grateful to be able to have shared it with her and to share it with you. I hope you enjoy. Excellent. Well, Renee, thank you so much for being here on the Smiling Human podcast. I'm very excited about our conversation today.
Super happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So I'll ask you the question I ask all guests at the head of the show. What's the last thing that made you smile?
Ooh, the last thing that made me smile was a meeting that I had today with someone that is local in the Valley, and the fact that he just gave me so much of his time just a few hours ago. And it was just really heartwarming to hear him want to support local businesses. And yeah, we had a great moment together today while getting coffee that made me smile.
Fantastic. The role and richness of community is becoming ever more apparent day by day, so I'm glad to hear that.
No kidding.
Now, the audience would have got a little bit of an overview of you from the intro, but there is great depth to the work that you're doing and the sort of journey that you've come through. And I know that since we've had a brief interaction before this. So I would love if you could share for the audience, how is it that you came into this role of bringing play back into adult life?
Yeah. So there's two parts to this journey. The first part is personal. The second part is professional. Which one do you want me to dive into first?
Let's start with the personal.
Okay. So I am a perfectionist. And ironically, I grew up in a household that told me ever since I was 4 years old that I was going to be an artist. I was good at art. I was so creative. It became a part of an internalized sense of identity that weirdly I had to follow when I got to be a college student. So I went to art school, ironically, because my parents told me to. And so, yeah, right, really funny, very ironic. I also rebelled against my parents by becoming a Christian when I was 11, which is also a part of the irony of the story. But eventually it kind of got to a point where I was really struggling with trying to figure out how to create authentically from a place that felt good, because my day-to-day experience in college and in high school was just dread. I had this sense of I need to become really good at drawing so that I can learn how to do animation programs so I can get a job at Pixar. And it was like this weight that kind of made me sick to my stomach my entire college career, to the point where the pressure was so intense that I ended up just sort of going, you know what? I don't feel like I'm skilled enough or talented enough to do the really hard corporate stuff. So I'm going to not go that route anymore, and I'm going to become a teacher. And that sort of perfectionism and this idea of creativity has to equal production was really coloring my early world as a creative. I went into teaching, realized it was a completely and totally different skill that was not having to do with art or creating, and I was absolutely addicted. And I became obsessed with becoming essentially the best teacher that I could possibly become, and it became the only thing I ever thought about. And I didn't care about making art anymore at all. It became something that was actually really disgusting to me. I then went through a very big surprise. 5 years into my marriage, my husband decided that he didn't want to pursue the marriage anymore. And he essentially left the marriage to be with another woman that we worked with. Just completely destroyed my sense of reality. And I was at rock bottom because I had moved out to Arizona with no family just to be with him and to do this job as a teacher. So I had to start over with my identity. And I remember in the very early stages of my divorce, I had this teacher that came up to me and she bought me The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And I was like, oh God, the last thing I need is like making art. Like, I just don't even want to think about like the burden and the feelings that I have associated with this. And she was like, no, I promise it's not like that. I really, really recommend it. And I used The Artist's Way as a part of my journey to get through my divorce and to essentially reconnect with this deeper, authentic person that I knew I needed to find. I was in psychoanalysis at the time and had been for about 5 years, 6 years. And my analyst at the time was really encouraging me to do two things: never do anything I didn't want to do, and to get my body back. And The Artist's Way was this really great complement to what I was already doing. And so it was challenging me with all of these questions of, why don't you want to create? What's in the way? And then what do you actually want to create that you've been denying yourself all of these years? And that was a really hard thing for me because I identified as a creative already. And coming to terms with the fact that my identity of what I was supposed to create from my parents and then what I really wanted to create sort of came out through The Artist's Way. And I realized the intense amount of healing that came through finding your authentic voice through creating. And I started doing burlesque dancing. I started performing, singing. I started doing open mics around the valley. And I realized like my creativity is actually rooted in performance and not necessarily in like making art. And I also found a love for collage, which I had already loved for years, but I sort of pulled back out and I started exploring, I think basically a sense of my unconscious, almost like a Rorschach card through the images that I was selecting through these magazines and what I was choosing to create, and sort of being really open and playful with the process. In that stage, I remember I had a long conversation with a friend of mine, and I was complaining about like, God, I need to get out of teaching. I need to get away from my ex-husband. I just like need to start my life over. But what am I going to do? And we had this brainstorming session intentionally to figure out like, what's my ideal job? This was like 8 years ago. And we came up with this idea of creating a play studio. And it was like all the things I wanted. It was like absolutely giving me a platform for performance. It was keeping me as a teacher, which is something I deeply love and enjoy and feel like I'm made to do. It was allowing me to be multimodal in music, in art, in dancing, in performance, in improv, and everything. And on top of that, it allowed me to work with adults, which was something that I was really interested in because one of my favorite nights in the professional world was curriculum night, when the parents would come in and I would just show them what their kids were doing. And they would be like, wow, this is like the best time I've had in years, which made me really concerned and put this question of like, what the hell are we doing in society right now as adults? So I had this idea and I just sort of was really insecure at the time. I put it in my back pocket. So I got like really excited and then I dropped it, right? Is what we all do when we're feeling insecure. And eventually I went through another series of traumas. My dad died of COVID in 21, which allowed me a tiny chance of a financial opportunity to sort of see like, okay, I can take a break if I need to. I found out I was going to be permanently disabled. I've got late stage arthritis and I got that news and I was just completely devastated. And then my ex-husband actually ended up dying. And there was so much emotion packed in like a 3-year period that I started to really question why I'm doing the teaching thing, what I'm supposed to be doing with my life, where I'm headed. And I just couldn't stop wrestling with that idea in the back of my head. Like, play has saved you. It's time to start bringing it to other people. And I really wrestled with the call, as they say in the hero's journey. I was like, no. I need to go back to school. I need to get my credentials. I need to whatever. And I just kept fighting it until finally I don't believe necessarily, I'm not a very spiritual person, but man, if you ever get a sign from anything, it's something like this. I had a very cushy admin job in my school that I worked for, and they basically said, we didn't get funding. You either have to go back on the front lines and be on your feet all day, which I couldn't do, or you have to become a principal, which I wasn't interested in, or we have to let you go. And I knew in my heart it was time. And so even though I didn't choose it, I felt like it came upon me, and I was like, okay, this is it. This is the push that I needed. This is the time for me to go ahead and start my business. And so I ended up founding my LLC. I found a branding coach. I got started and I started rolling.
Wow. Some of this is news to me, and thank you for your willingness to be transparent and vulnerable about all the twists and turns along the journey. The through lines that I've seen, or heard rather, is obviously this aspect of creativity, and there is a crossover with creativity, authenticity, feeling, and play. I think these are all sort of columns or balls that are being juggled, so to say, in the journey that you've laid out here. And so what I am most curious about is, in your experience, and we can keep it towards your story here and then we can broaden it out. How do you see the relationship between creation and creativity and play?
Yeah.
I want to offer that, and we'll see where we go from there.
Yeah. So I was actually thinking about this just earlier on my own. So we have like these definitions for these terms that I feel like can be really limiting. And then we have a cultural way in which we talk about these terms that I think is kind of the standard way of understanding stuff. So like when we say creativity, there's usually this sort of like intuitive addition to the definition of just making something that includes some kind of experiential quality that's embodied. So we'll talk about that one because it seems to be that's the main way I think people talk about creativity. So, Rick Rubin came out with that great book, The Creative Act, where he talks about like creativity allowing an individual to be like a vessel for a message outside of themselves. It's almost like a spiritual process, which Julia Cameron also refers to and talks about quite a bit. And it's about sort of like surrendering to something outside of yourself so that you can become the vessel for this message. Jack White talks about this all the time in a lot of interviews, where he'll say something along the lines of, I don't really actually do anything. I just sort of like show up and then I surrender, and then something inside of me like comes through my body and I can't even take credit for it. And when I listen back to it, it almost feels like I'm listening to something that's not even made by me. So there's sort of this mysterious quality to creativity that I think a lot of people experience when they're creating. If you're not in the creative world and you don't have this sort of addiction or need to create in order to survive, which a lot of artists sort of talk about, there's sort of the lack of mystery isn't experience, like the mystery, I guess, isn't necessarily experienced, but they like hear whispers about it and they want to know what that means. But the baseline understanding is like when you create something, you tap into something inside of yourself and then you make it. And it may or may not be the thing that you thought it would be, but there's a process and then there's some kind of pleasure that's involved. And then there's the desire to do more. With play, I think play, if you talk about it in terms of a timeline, creativity is kind of something that follows play. So play is kind of like this state of being or this relationship that almost has like a symbiotic relationship to creativity. So creativity can happen without play. You can create and you can produce and you can not be in a playful state. But when you are in a playful state or you're embodying that orientation towards playfulness while you're creating, I feel like that's when you sort of supercharge it and it becomes this really incredible experience that people get addicted to and talk about getting addicted to. So I think in creativity, when you're making something, there's this act of surrender that's required in order to kind of find and then produce. And play is almost the state of being that sets the groundwork for the surrender, because there's curiosity and a sense of wonder that's like the foundation first. And that curiosity and sense of wonder can really combat any fear that might take place when you're about to let go or surrender towards something that's unknown. And I think you can maybe do that without a state of play. I haven't quite figured this out yet. But I do think that for those that don't have that as something that's in their DNA, play immediately sort of gets you into a place where you can explore freely without having this inner critic in the way as you're creating that just completely makes you halt to a standstill and doesn't allow you to get any further. So it's almost like creativity maybe can exist without play. Haven't decided or figured that part out yet, but I do know that when you're in a play state, creativity can flourish in a way that is just it is unbelievable and magical in a way that is just hard to explain almost.
Thank you. I love so much of what you've put forward, particularly the notion that play sets the arena for creativity to come forward. I'm reminded of some of the work of Rollo May, a psychoanalyst, and he wrote, Right, yeah, for those who don't know, an extraordinary thinker, writes in a very accessible manner, unlike a lot of other psychoanalysts. So I would recommend The Cry for Myth as well as The Courage to Create. And that's the one that came to my mind while you were speaking, Renee, is that in that, I want to bring in one of his ideas, but I'll just put a little pin in it for now because I want to lay the land in order to get there, which was when we were talking about becoming a vessel. So being able to clear space inside of consciousness, clear space inside of our experience in order to allow something that is beyond the ego, beyond the persona, beyond the structured rational mind, the analytic, to become embodied, to actually pass through us as a channel. It requires subordination of the ego to what we might call the archetype of the self in psychology. And what I find particularly interesting about this is there's actually a blending of Eastern philosophy, Jungian thought, behavioral psychology. They're all sort of intersecting at this idea that when we get our ideas of what we ought to be out of the way, including the idea that we're responsible as an individuated self for the full creative potential that exists inside of us, that's just anxiety provoking, really. Like if we don't let that go, so much burden is placed on us that we are actually not able to fulfill. And so this idea that we can subordinate ourselves to a space or an energy or a quality of being that is innate in our humanness that allows us to be almost the translator of potential into the real, and that's the act of creation. How this relates to play is there's a term inside of Hindu philosophy called Leela, and Leela is what the gods do when they embody themselves. So when the divine spirits come down and they are in their avatar form, they are in Leela. And Leela means play, literally. There's this playful activity, and they are stewards of deep and powerful creative energy, yes, but their access and embodiment of Leela is a direct result of their wisdom. And I think it's the same wisdom that comes from the subordination of this small self to whatever grand energy allows us to come forward. And how this relates to May, this will be the last piece that I'll tie in here, is that in his book, he talks about the pre-creative state, or just before something really powerful is about to happen. And he gives examples of how that is actually a deeply anxious state for a lot of creatives. That there's this nervous tension in the body where this subordination is about to take place. You say, well, why might that be anxiety producing or provoking? Well, in order to subordinate, we actually have to let go of control. And I think that's the same for the creative process and the play process. We relinquish some element of our sense of control in order to open up the pathway for these things to come through. So beautifully put.
I really appreciate that. Both of May's books that you brought up are two of my all-time favorites. Now I want to go back and read them again. I'm thinking about children right now, and the very last thing that you were talking about in terms of like relinquishing control and identity. A child, especially in their very early phases of life, have really high play instincts, or at least they should, right? If they're developing in a healthy way. And those really high play instincts come from the fact that their identity is not fully developed yet. And so they have almost a lack of assumptive quality towards their view of information that's readily available to them in their senses. So when they're like exploring in the forest, and let's say, they're 6 or 7 years old, and thank God mom lets them do that, they're looking for some kind of discovery, and they don't know what that might be. They have no assumptions about what that could be because they yet have a database for creating that anxiety, right? And so that database is really low or almost non-existent, and their identity is fairly new and budding. And so they have basically this blank slate that allows them to play at a higher capacity often than adults, because they're coming into this world and they're going, I don't know what I'm going to find, but I'm going to look for it. And then they start finding things. And since it's so novel, it has this play-like quality to it. Scott Eberly, he came up with these phases of play in terms of like the actual process or the experience that's embodied. And it starts with anticipation, which, maybe in an adult could look like or feel like anxiety. So you have this anticipatory quality of like, you're not sure what's coming, but like, something is coming. And then there's this element of surprise when the thing does arrive in its novelty. And then that leads directly into pleasure. And then as the pleasure is happening, you're grounding and learning and creating a sense of understanding, which then immediately makes you stronger and more capable, which then makes you feel like you want to do it again because now you have a strengthened sense of self. And so as a kid, they're going through these cycles all the time, every time they interact with the real world. But when we're adults, we've got this huge database now of when I've done this before, this outcome happens. And when I have been told I'm this, I know that people know who I am. And so I have to stay that way. So there almost becomes this database that sort of drives the programming that creates this sort of static quality to experiencing from the adult's perspective. They go out to the world and they go into the forest and they're like, yeah, I already know what's here. And I know that if I go into the dark place, I'm probably going to end up getting cold and lonely and scared and lost. So we're not going to do that. And if I go towards this direction, I'm just going to maybe find some beautiful things. Maybe I'll get lost. So I'm going to stay on the path, and then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to go home. And when someone asks me about my time in the forest, I'm going to go, it was fine. Right? Because we've already pre-decided what our experience is going to be based on our previous database. And so John Vervaeke in his work, trying to find sort of a strengthened sense of self and to integrate and, all of these things that you're talking about in terms of behavioral science and Jungian psychology and analysis and even Eastern philosophy, there's this sense of finding the self requires the veil of the perceived reality that the individual has created to be lifted so that real reality is revealed to them. And I think you can't have that happen if you are in adult assuming mode. You have to create a sense of wonder and curiosity that you don't freaking know everything. There is mystery that you are going to encounter if you look for it. And that is what play can do, is it can tell you or create an orientation towards the world and your being that you don't have it figured out, which means there's possibilities to discover, and that can sort of create this cycle for a really rich environment for creativity. And I think that there's no coincidence that most artists and creatives have a sense of wonder about the world, especially about their internal, like, emotional world, or they have a sense of curiosity about the physical world or the spiritual world. Because if you have somebody that thinks they know everything, usually you're going to end up finding a non-playful or non-creative type personality.
That's such a powerful point. And I noticed in myself when you were speaking about the necessity to peel back the assumptive veil as a precursor for wonder, awe, the creative experience, and play. One of the things that arose for me was in maybe a shift in the analogy to say that rather than peeling it back, which is a totally fine analogy and there's nothing wrong with it, the way that I've been working with it in myself to maintain this connection to mystery, to maintain the channel of creativity and play, is to deeply and repeatedly integrate the recognition that there is more unknown than known, and that inside the unknown isn't just the dark, scary parts of the forest, but there's actually a lot more gold than there is things to fear inside that mystery. And this kind of speaks to the idea of synchronicity, or the divine providence, psychoid phenomenon, using Jung's terms, where when we are in this deeply creative state, or even just an open state of mind and heart, maybe flow, that the distinction between the internal and the external starts to blur in a really meaningful way. And I almost imagine that realm, that slice, if we could call it that, that's the play zone. That's where we're making real this imaginative, unconscious potentiality of human essence, and also having that same energy fed back into us by our playmates, and being shaped by that, and using the yes and mentality, right, of improv, which is saying, I don't know, but like, let's go with it. Let's see what's going to happen, what's going to be here. And so what I am curious about, Renee, is what have you done in your work to support adults who are maybe afraid of that mysterious realm, disconnected from that communication with their unconscious, or communication with something other than the thing that knows? How do you bring people into that space?
Yeah, I think, man, I mean, I'm tempted to be like, you educate them, you like tell them about how great it is. Like, that seems to be like such a standard answer that I feel like is, the natural thing that I should put there. But to be honest, I'm just so not a fan as a Socratic teacher of telling people exactly what they need to be doing and all the information that they must be missing, and then having them essentially go, okay, so the information that I have that's missing is always going to be coming from an external source. I can't figure it out myself. I have to wait for somebody else to tell me, which is exactly what our education system does to kids. And so we lose more autonomy, more agency, and we continue the lie that we're not capable of figuring stuff out for ourselves. So usually what I like to do is instead of like talking big talk with them, or even having conversations like this with people that are coming into my play work, I just show them. I just do it. And I kind of do it in a way that has an understanding that if I can kind of just trick them a little bit and get them into the arena and really take it nice and slow and create a process that builds up courageous like momentum, then I can get them into the real juicy stuff towards the end, and they don't even realize that it's happened. So I often will start with very basic improv stuff. The first thing that comes into your head when I say the word cheese, and then describing and talking about the process. Did you have 10 words come into your mind at once and you had difficulty picking one? Did you have an image that appeared in front of your mind and you had to assign a word to it and that was difficult? Did you have a word that immediately came up without you having to do any work at all, and you're kind of wondering like why anyone's struggling in the first place, and you're sort of saying like that was really easy? Is there TV static and all of a sudden you've forgotten every single word that you've ever known? That conversation alone with a group of adults, just starting with something as simple as first thought, best thought, word association, will get them to immediately realize that there are a million ways to experience like the inner sort of like the well of the preconscious, like how people access the preconscious and how many different ways and mechanisms there are within individuals. That immediately gets them curious about who they are, and then they want to practice. So then it's just a matter of like, okay, now we're going to do 30 of these suckers. And then afterwards, we're going to talk about which words flowed well, which words didn't. Where are we sort of struggling emotionally? Did we come against any inner critic that yelled at you? Did you have shame arrive? And then talking about how that is the positive work, about like, if that happened, this is the juice. Like you are now entering into the arena and this is the good stuff. And sort of encouraging that anything that they would normally criticize as being a problem in this space is welcomed and is the whole entire point in the practice. And then once they get kind of a little warmed up, we go to the next risk level, where now you might have to create a movie title based on an image that I give you, and you have to do it publicly in front of everyone else. So now the risk just increased quite a bit, and now you might have before had words that came really easily, but now you're really struggling, and then asking yourself the question of like, is it because I'm afraid of what other people will think? Is it because I want to create a really funny movie title and there's a lot of pressure on me being clever or funny? Is there a question of, I don't know what's going on, my brain just blanks and I'm actually disconnected from knowing what's going on? And then moving to the next phase and sort of like building momentum until in the end, they're usually collaborating with a group of people and they have to create something that's a little bit bigger or a little bit more robust. Or the games are sort of getting more intense and you might have to like, do something that's more performative and ridiculous according to society standards, where like now you're like walking around, like a duck or whatever. And most people would find that really cringy, but I would never start there, right? It's almost like we're just, and by the time they're there, they're actually really involved and they're having a good time. So on my end, that requires a lot of marketing and pulling in specific clients that have already a predetermined desire within themselves to practice play. So one thing I kind of always say to people is I'm not working with beginners. I'm not working with people that are terrified of play and are looking to sort of enter in as an infant into the world. I'm kind of looking for people that are already interested, feel blocked, and need an arena to practice. And that's sort of my niche, is sort of pulling in people that have a little bit of the instinct, but they just want more, or they want to be able to unblock or tap into it. And so I think to answer your question, it's like people that are really, really scared because of the fact that I just go straight in. It depends on the individual. They could enjoy it and immediately flow. They could get really intimidated. So usually there's a sense of like, I need to reveal that there's going to be risk involved and that's the point. And then whoever wants to come in is usually the person that's already pre-primed and ready to go and wants to work on themselves. And most of the clients that I have are in therapy, working on themselves, interested in self-improvement, have some sense that they are bullshitting themselves to a degree and want to not.
Brilliant. I love that. And it's very clear why that would be more effective than just pulling people who have never actually touched on that particular element. One thing comes to mind, which has only recently entered into my consciousness, which is the balancing between the analytical and the analogical. I didn't realize that there was actually a word for this. Yeah. And it blew my mind. So the rational mind is the analytical. It's the one that is developing into adulthood. These are the reasons, the rules, the structures, the how I ought to be. The rational and analytical mind is in large part what constitutes the ego, this ego consciousness, the center of the conscious self. The analogical is where we work in analogies. You mentioned the Rorschach images. So being able to make associations, metaphor, analogy, that is the language and purview of the unconscious, of that aspect that is really desiring to come forward, that's natural. But when we don't even know that analogical thinking, I'm going to use that in quotes for anyone who's listening, analogical thinking is even possible, that we can develop it, that it is natural, innate, and necessary to our healthy psychic functioning, we're just going to rely on what we know. And this touches back in on the notion that we can't even really imagine anything beyond our assumptive sort of realm. And this touches on something that I spoke to. It was actually Trevor Yelich who brought it up in one of my previous episodes. And he said that imagination and memory are neurophysiologically quite proximal in the brain, and that our capacity to imagine is in part shaped by what we have experienced. And so unless we have a consistent practice of experiencing the revelation of the mystery through creation, through play or synchronicity, or the delving into the unconscious and having these aspects revealed to us through therapy, psychedelics, and the like, then we cannot even begin to imagine that there's a potential world out there beyond what we know. And so as soon as we integrate that piece and we go, okay, there's stuff I don't know, then this is where the analogical takes over. Okay, there's something I don't know. One part came out of that mystery. Can we make an association? What did I think? I saw a piece of Swiss cheese and a mouse. Like, that's what came to me when you said cheese. Okay, why? It doesn't really matter, but we can start to play in that realm. So I really love that you've brought all that forward. We'll take a short break here and then we'll come back with the second half of the show.
Perfect.
I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. Great. Well, we are now back with the second half of the show, which means we are into the section called the Question of the Week. This is where I ask our guest to bring forward an inquiry, something that's meaningful to them. Maybe they've already thought on it, maybe they want my take on it, or they might think it's important for you to hear us speak on. So, Renee, what have you got for us this week?
So, as someone who loves play, there's a dark shadow side to my personality and the way that I engage with the world. And that's sort of what I touched on earlier of being like this deep obsession with perfectionism and productivity. So as a result, I have a pretty negative relationship to, if we want to call it a virtue, the virtue of discipline. And I've been wrestling with this for a year. The question is, how do we cultivate a love of discipline while at the same time cultivating a love of play?
What a fantastic question, Renee. The first thing that arises for me is that although I am disciplined in my actions, in my business, in my life, I don't love discipline as such. I have respect for discipline. I admire and value it. But what I love is what it brings. I love the fruits of discipline, because the fruits of discipline are ease in my body, peacefulness in my relationships, success in my business, a sense of purpose and excitement about my life. Those are the fruits of discipline. Do I love getting up early, working out, eating healthy, not having cake, being responsible in all of my actions? Not always, because it's not easy. But that's not the point. The point for me is that discipline is the vehicle by which I can come into contact with the things that are deeply meaningful, enjoyable, and pleasurable in measures that don't undermine the well-being of my future self. So I've balanced that with a love of play too, because in some sense, I would love to play all the time. Why not? Why can't we, Peter Pan, right? The puer aeternus, as we might say in this Jungian realm. Well, actually, you know what? I said this to a dear friend of mine just the other day. We had hung out one-on-one for the first time, and they texted me afterwards and said, I'm really surprised at how playful you were. I thought that you were a no-nonsense kind of guy. And I said to them, I am equal parts sense and nonsense, and that is the only way that I can function. And I think that we need to see discipline and play in a very similar manner. It's the yang to the yin, the unstructured, the fluid, the emergent, the pleasurable, with the necessary, the structured, the contingent, and the temporal in some sense. And that when we have the wherewithal and the practice, perhaps the wisdom, to move between those in our lives in a way that doesn't cling to one or become averse to the other, this is where we start to find true balance, in my take.
Yeah, I'm sort of in the intellectualizing of all of it, and have yet to really like practice it. It's almost like it's in its culminating phase where like the culture in the little petri dish is really starting to grow, and I'm I feel like I have a lot of answers and I'm ready to get it into my body. But the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is a child can't play if they don't feel safe, or at least safe enough. And that safety comes from the discipline of their parents. And the parents creating a safe enough environment comes from structure and routine and a knowledge that if something goes wrong, there's going to be a response from someone outside of the child that's going to come to their aid. And that allows a freedom within that child to explore and feel safe enough to explore. And if they have anxious parents, they don't feel safe, and that play instinct is going to get suppressed, especially as they get older. So I'm interpreting this in a way that feels like nurturing an inner child that like is explorative and wants to play. And I'm almost very hesitant to call it a child because I think it's a being that doesn't have an age. It's the part of ourselves that's curious and that has a sense of wonder, and that doesn't need to be tied to this identity of a child. I think that can kind of get icky and a little bit dangerous. But there's another aspect that we can call kind of the inner parent. And when we establish an inner parent that is disciplined and that can create a sense of safety for the self to explore and play, that is a symbiotic relationship that one is almost dependent upon the other, which is really interesting because I'm looking back on my life and sort of wondering, like, did I have to have a sense of true safety in order for me to go out and explore playfully? You know, I'm going back to kind of my divorce when everything was just completely fallen apart and I wasn't really eating or sleeping. And, you know, I had a routine, which was my job, that was kind of holding me all together. And I wonder what would happen if I didn't have that. I'm looking at my life right now in the early stages of being a business owner, and there's less structure than I've ever had in my entire life. And I'm finding the natural consequences that I'm becoming less playful. And so there's this question of, if I get my discipline up and I create a sense or an environment of safety, is my ability to play going to flourish because now I feel safe enough and I don't feel like I'm in survival mode? And I think the answer is 100% yes.
Mm. There might be an interesting realm to explore if we consider that there might be a conflation of meaning with discipline, structure, and responsibility. So, in using your analogy of the young child who feels more safe when the parents are disciplined, if we look at these three words, discipline actually comes from and shares the root of disciple.
Disciple.
Right? It's this learning, it's this taking on, it's the growing in wisdom. That's discipline, right? And responsibility is what I believe, in some sense, is what you were speaking to about what the parents have, their ability to respond, responsibility, in this circumstance that the child hurts itself or something happens that scares them. Their responsibility, their capacity to be attuned to, aware of, and respond to whatever circumstances arise, that's what grants the safety, the consistency in the responsibility. And it's the consistency that I think bridges structure and discipline and responsibility. And this, the birth of these three is trust, and it's safety, and it's consistency. And the reason I want to introduce that is because in some sense, we learn through play. And so the heart of discipline, in an etymological, almost an energetic sense, is driving us towards the same end as play. But for whatever God-forsaken reason, we have this notion that the only way we learn is if it's very strict and regimented, and we're going to give you these ideas and you need to read it. No, you kidding me? That's not how we function. No part of nature is linear in this sense. It's all that analytical sense. So when we're talking about discipline, the conflation that discipline is very rigorous, regimented, and structured, I think is kind of a misnomer in a sense, a misattribution of what discipline actually is, insofar as it extends beyond consistency. If we can be consistent in communing with our goal, and be that goal learning or play, then we are actually exercising discipline rather than the sort of idea of tightness and rigidity and no curved lines. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it's like intuitively I can feel it, and it's there's like this sense of, yeah, there's something in the shadow that I think wants to sort of say, discipline's the bad guy, play is the good guy. And it wants to create a false dichotomy so that there's no growth at all, so that there's sort of stagnancy, right? So you can stay the same, like don't change, enemy, change. So there's such a like a delight in thinking about, first of all, what you said makes perfect sense, and I absolutely love that. And I'm thinking about discipline in a new way. But I think when I stop thinking about it analytically and I feel into it, I imagine like this person, this woman, right? That's like striving in responsibility for the love of the good and for the love of learning and like being a disciple and growing and transforming. And that cannot exist without the other part, which is play. It's like it's happening all in the same being. And becoming her is something that I just can't shake. And I'm waking up every day and I'm in shadow and I'm like, God, this sucks. I'm so sick of this. And so I'm like trying to surround myself with like symbols or ideas so that I can constantly be inspired. Like I started wearing like a Mary necklace and I'm just like, like there's something about the image of like this holy mother that like is fully responsible and consistent, and also has this openness and this vulnerability and this ability to move and play in a feminine way that I just really, really sense is where I'm headed. And so I think, yeah, the question maybe should be, how do we cultivate an action of consistency while being in the throes of an internal paradox that play and responsibility are opposites? Mm-hmm. When Dr. Stuart Brown says that the opposite of play is not work, it's depression.
Oof. Maybe one additional distinction that would serve our end of discovery here is the difference between denial and delay. So in some senses, when discipline in its rigor and restriction is the embodiment of denial, denying that which is authentic, genuine, and needed, be it rest, rejuvenation, play, etc., then we're actually anti-life. We're not life-affirming. We're not being generative in that sense. And that is distinct from denial, because denial doesn't say no, it says not yet. And that difference is the difference between maybe tyranny and wisdom, where we're not tyrannizing this innocent, awe-inspired, wondrous aspect of our consciousness. What we're doing is we're saying, yes, and it's going to be so much better if we do the dishes first, because then I can actually relax and be entirely present with the play at a later time, because I will not be focused and worried about all these other responsibilities and duties that I have that have gone undone. And it is in this relationship with delay, and not only delayed gratification, that's where we hear it a lot, but delayed satiation, delayed exploration, whatever. Delaying the thing that is important, but not the most important. That's a distinct characteristic of the human psyche. Our ability to sacrifice the present for the good of the future. And we cannot be doing this all the time with every decision, because that actually undermines the whole point of sacrifice in the first place. If I've sacrificed the present for the future, when the future comes, I have to reap the benefit of my sacrifice. I have to be willing to fully receive whatever it is that I've sacrificed for.
Yeah.
In order to have it make any sense in the first place. And so there's almost an oscillation that we have to practice, where we go, okay, when I do this discipline, the fruit of it is I have cleared the field for me to be able to dance, prance, sing, and sew.
Yeah. Oh, you're giving me so much to think about. It's like you know something, but you don't know something, right? Or you're ready to know and you're just in knowing. And so everything you're saying, it's like, oh, I've already sort of been thinking about or thinking about or thinking about. But hearing it from an external place and having you say it all is just so, it's like so energizing. And I'm almost even thinking about it in terms of like when you are doing all of this sort of responsibility and you are staying consistent and you're allowing yourself to like create this playing field for yourself in the future. I'm now coming back to like Scott Eberly, and I'm thinking about how this can become a part of play itself by putting it into the anticipation phase, where it's like when I'm doing my dishes and I'm like grumpy about it and my inner parent is abandoning me and my inner child is throwing a tantrum, right? And I'm separated and I'm in this moment of feeling, completely at odds with self and not being integrated or whole. Using this idea to save me, right? Of course, as I always do, to think about doing the dishes as a part of almost like foreplay, where you are creating an anticipatory sense of like, I'm foreplaying with my future self, because if I create a super clean house and I create all of my ducks in a row, then now I'm open and free to anything that could happen. And I have to be in this receiving spontaneousness. I have to be in surrender. And I can't ever be in surrender if I am always in survival mode, where I'm waiting for the explosions of my past behavior to arise because I didn't take care of it in advance. And if I'm going, I wish I could play, and I'm not being responsible or consistent, and then a fire pops up, and now I'm like, well, now I only can deal with the fire and my attention can be nowhere else. There's no room for play whatsoever. And I've got a friend of mine who is just starting to be my accountability partner. And that was one of the things we were talking about, where it was like, okay, we've come to the bottom of this. We know that in order for us to play, we have to be disciplined. We know that this is the key. And it really does help, but it is so, we can talk about it all day, but again, like waking up and doing it is a practice. It really is a dojo in and of itself. And so I can be really leaning towards one, which is play, as my personality. But there is a shadow to it if you're not careful and it's unchecked. And so I can come to the world and be like, I'm a play expert. I'm super good at this. And then, you lift the curtain and you see the shadow of like what's happening as a result of like not doing both. And I think, like Aristotle talks about, or like John Vervaeke talks about, finding the optimal grip. You're looking for this Aristotelian mean in the middle, where you're activating both and you're not abandoning one for the other and then ending up with something that's actually not either of them at all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well put, Renee. One of the pieces that I didn't hear you speak to directly, but I think is maybe an undercurrent that you're speaking to, is this notion that our duties are somehow punitive, and that there's this perspective, maybe it's from the ego, maybe it's from this younger aspect, but it's like, I have to do the dishes, I have to clean, I have to do all these things. And it's like, no one's punishing you.
Right.
Like, the adult life is not punishment. Sure, there is suffering. We know that, rule number one. Thank you, Siddhartha Buddha. Pain is inevitable, but we have the power to choose our approach to these things. And if we choose to narrativize our duties as punitive, as painful annoyance, as hindering obligations, what kind of field are we setting for ourselves? We're creating a tension that is not generative. Some tension is generative. That's the anticipatory phase that you're speaking to with Eberle. But this is not a generative tension. This is a degrading and a draining tension. And so that's one piece to remember. And I also wanted to note that when you're speaking about foreplay, if we remove the sexual connotation, that word literally means before play.
Yep.
Ta-da! Perfect.
Right.
So this is maybe something to consider, and maybe we can speak to this in the closing frame here, but the preconditions for play are not playful as an adult. How odd
How
that
odd.
we actually have to, not to be in antithesis of play, but we have to be in a tangential,
Yes.
in a related sort of positioning, maybe a sextile to use the astrological terms here, in relationship to this play in order to facilitate that space internally and externally. And if we look at it that way, then we start to expand the scope of what play entails. There's the act, the living, blooming play, and then there's all the other necessary preconditions that, if we are wise to them, make that blooming ever more sweet.
Yes. And I think also in the body, like you talked about earlier, there's a deep knowing of self-trust, and that trust allows for the ladder down into the unconscious to grow longer. The more self-trust we have, I think the farther we can go without entering into the danger zone. And that's where all of this symbology and all of this really rich storytelling and ability to create in this sort of beautiful state, you called it analogical earlier. What did you call it?
Analogical.
Analogical. This format, this language that's not, sort of this left-brained words, analyzing the self that we think is the self that uses this language. There's another self that doesn't necessarily have the words to speak. And when we enter into that place and we're able to access it, like that's what integration is all about. That's where we want to go when we're in a state of creativity and play. And without self-trust, we cannot get there. There's no access to that world. And that's what causes so much like physical ailments, diseases, like just massive amounts of psychic pain. Like there's so much that happens if we don't have the self-trust to integrate that part. And that's why I believe that creativity and play is such a fundamental aspect to being a person, is that it is the pathway towards integration and becoming whole. And for me, like this question of self-trust is something that I've always wrestled with, and that I feel like without having necessarily a ton of understanding, you can dance with it, you can play with it, you can have this idea, but I never one day in my life want to be like these asshole gurus that go out into the world and say, I've found the answer. I am the God. I'm the one who has the book to unlock your problems and to solve everything because I have made and completed the journey. Right? What a disgusting position to put yourself in. And so I'm doing the journey with everybody as I'm going through it. And this struggle that I personally have is something that, I've been laying the groundwork for a decade. And now I'm in the next level of the arena where I'm in this intermediate phase of like, okay, something is still worming and squirming inside of me, and I'm ready to unlock and go to the next level, of a level that just goes on sort of into eternity. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate the ability to ask a question that I feel like is more vulnerable and honest, rather than something that I feel like is, you're giving me things that I wasn't necessarily prepared for in a podcast, and that's made this so much more the worthwhile, is because I feel like I'm learning just as much as I hope anyone else listening does.
Thank you so much, Renee. It's been a sincere pleasure, and I have gleaned quite a bit of value from this as well. And for those listeners who are curious, feeling playful perhaps, and want to connect with you more directly, where can they find you?
So I'm mostly on Instagram, is my main platform, at the PlayRX Cure. And I am called PlayRX, but my handle's the PlayRX Cure. And my goal and my focus is threefold: providing in-person workshops to people in Phoenix, Arizona, providing online workshops for those that don't live near me once a month, and then providing hopefully value through what I'm creating through these play breaks, where I'm sort of catching you doom scrolling and attempting to immediately, like we talked about earlier, not educate you, but engage you in play and sort of hopefully shift the brain into a different state where your neurons are firing in a different way. And that allows you to get out of this sort of helpless sense of doom scrolling into a sense of hopeful agency through the use of play and that exact little 1.5 minute moment. So that's where you can find me.
Excellent. And I will say that I always have a smile on my face when I see your play breaks come up, and I engage when I feel inspired. And it's actually on Instagram that I found Renee initially, and I was so moved and activated by your mission. And I mentioned that in the message that I first sent, that I knew I had to get you on here and to share more about it. So the links to all of your goodies will be in the description as always. Renee, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Oak.
And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind the scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.